My son called me a burden on a rainy Tuesday morning. Not during an argument. Not because he was angry. He said it the same way someone might complain about an old appliance that had stopped working, quickly, casually, as if those words had been sitting in his heart for a long time. He didn't know I was standing in the hallway. I had only come downstairs to refill my coffee. The mug was still warm in my hands when I heard my daughter-in-law ask, "How much longer is this going to last?" There was a long silence. Then my son sighed. "I don't know. But I can't keep living like this. Dad's become a burden." I didn't drop the mug. I didn't interrupt them. I simply stood there, staring at the steam rising from my coffee, wondering how one sentence could make 42 years of fatherhood suddenly feel invisible. The strange thing was, a part of me wasn't surprised, because those words hadn't appeared overnight. They had been growing quietly for months, hidden inside forgotten conversations, missed dinners, and polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. I walked back upstairs before they saw me. That should have been the moment I confronted him. Instead, I opened the small wooden box I kept in my bedroom. Inside was my wedding ring, a faded birthday card my late wife had made for me 23 years earlier, and a folded piece of paper I hadn't looked at in almost a decade. I held it for a long time, then I smiled. Not because I was happy, because, for the first time in months, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and my son had no idea that the life he thought was ending was actually just beginning. My name is Richard Dawson, and I was 69 years old the morning I realized my own son no longer saw me as his father. He saw me as another responsibility, another bill, another problem to solve. If you'd asked anyone in our neighborhood a few years earlier, they probably would have described me as the man who was always fixing something. A loose mailbox, a neighbor's fence, a child's bicycle chain. Keeping busy had always been my way of feeling useful. After retiring from 38 years as a maintenance supervisor for the Chicago Transit Authority, I thought I'd finally have time to enjoy life with my wife, Helen. We had plans. Small ones. Drive across Wisconsin in the fall. Spend Christmas somewhere warm for once. Take ballroom dancing lessons, even though neither of us had any rhythm. Helen used to laugh and say, "We've spent our whole lives taking care of everyone else. Now it's finally our turn." But life has a way of rewriting plans without asking permission. She died from pancreatic cancer 14 months after that conversation. Sometimes I still catch myself reaching for the other side of the bed. Before I remember, it's been empty for 6 years. People say grief gets easier. They're wrong. You simply become better at carrying it. For the first year after Helen passed away, I stayed in the house we'd shared for nearly 40 years. Every room still sounded like her. The kitchen timer she insisted on using instead of her phone, the little wind chime outside the back porch. Her reading glasses resting exactly where she'd left them. I couldn't throw any of it away, not because I was trapped in the past. Because those ordinary things reminded me that love had once lived there. Eventually, living alone became harder than I wanted to admit, not physically, emotionally. The silence lasted too long. Dinner tasted different when there was nobody asking how my day had been. Even television seemed louder in an empty house. That's when my son, Daniel, suggested I move in with him. "Dad," he told me over coffee one Saturday morning, "that house is too much for one person now. Come stay with us. Emma and the kids would love having you around." I hesitated. Helen and I had always promised each other we'd never become a burden to our children. Daniel smiled when he noticed my expression. "You're not a burden," he said. "You're family." I believed him. Looking back now, I realize he believed it too. At least he did then. So I sold the house, not because I wanted to, because I thought I was moving toward family instead of away from loneliness. I packed 40 years of memories into 12 cardboard boxes, some furniture, a few photo albums, Helen's recipe book, the old coffee mug she'd bought me on our 25th anniversary, and that small wooden box I never let out of my sight. the one that held pieces of a life nobody else fully understood. When my grandson Ethan helped carry it into Daniel's garage, he smiled. What's in there, Grandpa? Treasure, I laughed. In a way. He grinned and ran back toward the house before I could explain. At the time, I thought that conversation would stay with me because it was sweet. I had no idea. One day that same wooden box would become the reason my son questioned everything he thought he knew about me. Moving into Daniel's house didn't feel strange at first. In fact, for the first few weeks, it almost felt like the beginning of a second life. Emma had cleaned out the guest bedroom before I arrived. Fresh white curtains hung over the window. A small reading lamp sat beside the bed. Even a framed family picture rested on the nightstand. "You're home now," she said with a warm smile. I wanted to believe her. Maybe that was my first mistake. The grandchildren made everything easier. 10-year-old Ethan loved hearing stories about how Chicago looked before smartphones and self-checkout stores. His younger sister, Lily, insisted I make pancakes every Saturday morning. She claimed mine tasted better than anyone else's. I never told her the secret wasn't the recipe. It was that I still used the same cast-iron skillet Helen and I had bought during our first year of marriage. Some things carry memories better than people do. For a while, life settled into a comfortable routine. Every morning, I woke before everyone else. I'd quietly make coffee, read the newspaper on the back patio, and water the flowers Emma had planted along the fence. By 7 o'clock, Daniel would rush through the kitchen, laptop bag over one shoulder, travel mug in his hand. "Morning, Dad." "Morning." Sometimes that was the entire conversation. I didn't mind. He worked long hours. He had responsibilities. I remembered what it was like trying to build a career while raising children. Life gets noisy. People get tired. I kept telling myself that love didn't always sound the way it used to. Then little things began changing. The first time it was barely noticeable. One evening, I set the dinner table while Emma finished cooking. Daniel walked in, glanced around and frowned. "Dad, you don't have to do that. I know. I've got it." His words weren't rude, but he removed the plates I'd carefully arranged and set them down again, exactly the way he preferred. It seemed silly, so I smiled and stepped aside. A week later, I folded the laundry while Emma was grocery shopping. She thanked me, but later that evening I overheard her quietly telling Daniel, "Your dad means well, but I have my own system." Again. Not cruel, just enough to make me wonder if helping was actually helping. So I stopped folding laundry. Then I stopped vacuuming. Then I stopped trimming the hedges after Daniel mentioned he'd hired a landscaping company. One by one, the small ways I'd always contributed quietly disappeared. Nobody asked me to stop existing inside the house. They simply stopped needing anything I knew how to do. It's a strange feeling, realizing the skills that once defined your life no longer have a place. I spent more time sitting on the back porch, watching birds, reading old novels, sometimes pretending to read while wondering whether anyone inside had noticed how quiet I'd become. Most days they hadn't. One afternoon, Ethan found me staring at an old photograph. It showed Helen and me standing beside our first home, both of us laughing because the paint on the front porch had barely dried. "Grandpa." He pointed at Helen. "Were you two always this happy?" I smiled. "No." He looked confused. "No. We had bad days too." "So, why are you smiling in every picture?" I thought about that for a moment, because photographs only capture a second. I finally said, "A marriage is everything that happens before and after the camera clicks." He nodded as though he understood. Maybe he did. Children often understand more than adults realize. Then he asked something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you miss Grandma every day?" I looked toward the empty swing in the backyard. Every single one. He didn't say anything after that. He simply sat beside me for nearly 15 minutes. No phone, no television, no questions. Just quiet company. Oddly enough, that little boy gave me something no adult in the house had given me in months. His time. As he stood to go back inside, He stopped at the patio door. "Grandpa?" "Yeah? I'm glad you live here." I smiled after he disappeared into the kitchen. Those 6 words stayed with me longer than he could ever have imagined, because deep down, I was beginning to wonder if everyone else felt the same. And a few days later, I accidentally overheard a conversation that answered that question far more clearly than I ever wanted. A few mornings later, I woke earlier than usual. Sleeps had become unpredictable after Helen passed away. Some nights I slept like a child. Others, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house until sunrise. That morning, the coffee maker in the kitchen wasn't working properly. I remembered seeing an old French press in one of the lower cabinets. Rather than turning on the lights, I walked downstairs as quietly as I could. The house was still dark, or so I thought. A faint light spilled from Daniel's home office. His door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't trying to listen. I wasn't even thinking about them. I was focused on finding coffee. Then I heard Emma's voice, soft, tired.
"Did you check the retirement communities I sent you?"
I froze. Daniel didn't answer right away. The silence lasted just long enough for my stomach to tighten. Finally, he spoke. "I looked, and they're expensive." Emma sighed. "I know they're expensive." Another pause. "I just don't think this arrangement is working anymore." I stayed exactly where I was, not because I wanted to hear more, because my feet suddenly felt too heavy to move. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I could hear it in his voice. He sounded exhausted. "Dad hasn't done anything wrong. I know. Then why does it feel like everything has changed since he moved in?" Emma wasn't angry. If anything, she sounded guilty for asking the question. "I feel like we're always adjusting our lives. We don't stay out late anymore. The kids spend every Saturday here. I worry every time we plan a vacation. It's like," she searched for the right words, "it's like we've stopped living for ourselves." Daniel didn't respond for a long moment. All I could hear was the ticking of the hallway clock. Then he quietly said, "I promised Mom I'd take care of him." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. Not because it hurt, because I hadn't known. Helen had made him promise. Of course she had. Even near the end, she was thinking about me instead of herself. Emma's voice softened. "I'm not asking you to abandon him. She stopped. "I miss having our house feel like ours." There was no cruelty in those words, only honesty. Honesty can sometimes cut deeper than anger. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I don't know what the right answer is anymore." Neither did I. For the first time since moving in, I realized my presence wasn't creating arguments. It was creating pressure. Pressure they tried to hide. Pressure that quietly followed every family decision. I could have walked away then. Instead, I heard the sentence that would stay with me for years. Emma asked softly, "Have you talked to your dad about any of this?" Daniel answered almost immediately. "How do you tell your own father?" His voice cracked for just a second. "That he's become a burden." The hallway seemed to disappear around me. I looked down at the coffee mug in my hands. My fingers had tightened around it without me noticing. A small crack spread across the side of the ceramic. I never felt it happen. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't storm into the room demanding an explanation. Instead, I quietly turned around and walked back upstairs before either of them realized I had been there. Inside my bedroom, I closed the door without making a sound. Then I sat on the edge of the bed. Across the room, Helen's recipe book rested on the shelf. Beside it sat the small wooden box Ethan had once called my treasure chest. I opened it. Inside lay my wedding ring, a faded birthday card, and the folded document I hadn't touched in years. This time, I unfolded it completely. I read every word, then I picked up my phone. There was only one number I needed to call, and when the woman answered, she sounded genuinely surprised to hear my voice. "I'm so glad you called, Richard. I've actually been waiting for this day." At that moment, I realized my life wasn't ending inside that house. It was about to begin somewhere no one in my family had ever imagined. The woman on the other end of the phone was named Caroline Mercer. The last time we'd spoken had been almost 8 years earlier. Back then, I'd told her I wasn't ready. Now, I finally was. "Richard," she said again, almost laughing with surprise. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me." "I almost did," I admitted. But Helen never did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Some silences carry sadness. This one carried memory. "I found the paperwork," I finally said. "I think it's time. I'll start everything today," Caroline replied. "Come by whenever you're ready." After hanging up, I folded the document carefully and placed it back inside the wooden box. Anyone else opening that box would have seen old keepsakes. I saw promises. Promises Helen had convinced me to make long before either of us imagined she'd be gone. Helen had always worried about one thing, not money, not illness, loneliness. A few months before she died, she looked at me across our hospital room and asked a question I'd never forgotten. "What will you do when I'm not here?" I hated that question, so I answered it with a joke. "I'll spend the rest of my life annoying Daniel." She smiled, but only for a second. Then she reached for my hand. "I'm serious, I know. You've spent your whole life taking care of people." She squeezed my fingers gently. "Promise me you won't stop living just because I'm gone." I told her I promised. At the time, neither of us understood how difficult that promise would become. A few weeks later, Helen asked me to visit a community center on the north side of Chicago. I assumed it was another support group. Instead, she introduced me to Caroline. Carolyn directed a non-profit organization that renovated abandoned buildings and turned them into affordable housing for veterans, widows, and retired seniors who had nowhere else to go. The place wasn't fancy. The walls needed paint. Half the windows still had plywood covering them, but everywhere I looked, people were building something together. Retired electricians, former teachers, army veterans, plumbers, carpenters, people whose careers had ended, but whose purpose hadn't. Helen watched me study the old building with a quiet smile. "You've been fixing things your whole life," she whispered. "Maybe someday you'll come here and help fix lives instead." I laughed. "We'll both come." She didn't answer. She simply looked away. Only later did I realize. She already knew that future belonged to me alone. After Helen passed away, Caroline called every few months, never to pressure me, just to check in. "We're always here," she'd say. Every time, I politely declined. I wasn't ready. Grief had convinced me that surviving each day was enough. Then Daniel invited me to move into his home. I told Caroline I'd probably never need the non-profit after all. "I think my family needs me," I had said. She sounded happy for me. I hope that's exactly what happens. Looking back, I think she hoped for me more than I hoped for myself. Now, sitting alone in my bedroom years later, I realized something painful. Nobody in this house actually needed me. They loved me, in their own way, but needing someone and making room for them are two very different things. I wasn't angry with Daniel, not yet. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice downstairs. I knew the pressure he carried: mortgage payments, college savings, long work hours, 2 growing children. He wasn't a cruel man, he was a tired one. That didn't make his words hurt any less, but it did stop me from hating him. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If I stayed, would anything ever change? Deep down, I already knew the answer. No, the house would become quieter. I'd try harder not to be in the way. They'd try harder not to make me feel unwanted. We would all pretend everything was fine. Until one day, it wouldn't be. That afternoon, I drove across the city alone, not to escape, to remember. The non-profit looked different now. Fresh brickwork, new windows, a small garden near the entrance. Children played on a swing set where broken concrete had once been. Inside, Caroline recognized me immediately. She smiled as though no time had passed at all. I wondered if today would ever come. So did I. She poured 2 cups of coffee before either of us spoke again. Then she slid a folder across the table. "I never closed your file." I looked at her, confused. "You kept it?" "Helen asked me to." My heart stopped for a moment before she died. Caroline continued softly. She came here by herself. I couldn't speak. She told me one day you might forget how valuable you are. Caroline looked directly into my eyes, so she asked me never to forget for you. I lowered my head. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. Then Caroline said something that changed the direction of my life.
Richard, we don't need your money.
We don't need donations. She smiled. We need you. No one had said those 3 words to me in a very long time, and I hadn't realized how desperately I needed to hear them. I didn't tell Daniel about my visit to Caroline. I didn't tell Emma either, not because I wanted to keep secrets, because I wanted to make one decision in my life without asking anyone's permission. For nearly 40 years, every major choice I'd made had revolved around someone else. My wife, my son, my family. There was nothing wrong with that. I'd gladly do it all again. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how to choose something for myself. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, looking around the small room that had been mine for the last 3 years. There wasn't much to pack. A few shirts, some jeans, Helen's recipe book, the family photo albums, and the little wooden box. Funny how an entire life can eventually fit into 2 suitcases. As I zipped the last one closed, I noticed Helen's old cardigan hanging in the closet. She'd forgotten it in the car years before she got sick. I had never washed it. The lavender scent was long gone, but every time I touched it, I remembered the woman who had made every ordinary day feel like home. I folded it carefully and laid it on top of everything else. Then I closed the suitcase. Around 7, I heard little footsteps racing down the hallway. A soft knock came at my door. "Grandpa? Come in." Lily peeked inside, still wearing dinosaur pajamas, even though she insisted they were dragon pajamas. Mom made waffles. "I'll be right there." She looked at the suitcases. "Are you going somewhere?" Children notice everything. "Just taking a little trip." For how long? I hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." She frowned. "Can I come?" I smiled despite the ache in my chest. "I think your mum and dad would miss you too much." She giggled. "They'll survive." I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. Then she wrapped her tiny arms around my waist. "I love you, Grandpa. I love you too, sweetheart." She ran downstairs before I could say anything else. I stood there for several seconds after she left. If walking away had only meant leaving Daniel, it would have been easier. Leaving the grandchildren felt like tearing away part of my own heart. Breakfast was unusually quiet. Daniel kept checking emails on his phone. Emma was organizing Lily's school forms. Ethan was trying to convince everyone he deserved a later bedtime because he'd be in middle school soon. Life continued exactly as it always had. Nobody realized. Everything was about to change. After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his car keys. "Dad, I'll probably be home late tonight. No problem. You need anything while I'm out?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. The same dark hair he'd inherited from Helen. The tiny scar above his eyebrow from falling off his bicycle when he was 12. The boy I'd once carried on my shoulders through the zoo because he'd been too tired to walk. He wasn't a bad man. He was simply overwhelmed. And somewhere inside all that pressure, he had forgotten I was still human. "No," I answered softly. "I've got everything I need," he smiled. "Good." Then he left. He had no idea. Those would be the last words we'd speak under the same roof. Once the house was empty except for Emma, I asked if we could sit on the back patio for a few minutes. She looked surprised. Of course. For a while, neither of us said anything. The breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass through the yard. Finally, I spoke. "Emma." She looked up. I heard the conversation. The color drained from her face. "What conversation?" "The one outside Daniel's office." Her hands froze around the coffee mug. For several long seconds, she couldn't speak. Then tears filled her eyes. "Oh, Richard, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to hear that." "I know. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know." She wiped her eyes quickly. "I feel awful." "You shouldn't." She looked at me in disbelief. I meant every word I said. I know. And that's exactly why I'm not angry. She stared at me, confused. Honesty isn't cruelty. Pretending everything is fine would have been worse. She began crying openly now. I've felt guilty for months. I know. I love you. I know. But sometimes, she struggled to finish the sentence. Sometimes I wanted my house back. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers. And you deserve to have it. She shook her head. No, I don't deserve this. This isn't your fault. It isn't Daniel's either. It's just life. For the first time since Helen died, I realized forgiveness doesn't always come after an apology. Sometimes, it comes from understanding that everyone is carrying burdens you cannot see. I stood up. Emma looked at the suitcases beside the back door. Her voice trembled. You're leaving. Yes. Does Daniel know? I slowly shook my head. I think it's better this way. She stood suddenly. Please wait until tonight. Talk to him. I smiled sadly. If I stay until tonight, you'll convince me to stay. And if I stay, we'll all go back to pretending. She covered her mouth as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Before walking away, I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a small envelope on the patio table. Give this to Daniel. When? After I've gone. She looked down at it but didn't touch it. On the front, in my handwriting, were only 6 words. For my son. When you're ready. Then I picked up my suitcases, opened the front door, and quietly walked out of the house that had never truly become my home. I didn't look back, because sometimes looking back is exactly what keeps you from finally moving forward. The first night after leaving Daniel's house, I didn't sleep. Not because I regretted my decision, because I kept imagining him walking through the front door, calling my name, checking my room, finding it empty. Then noticing the envelope on the patio table. Part of me wished I could see his face. Another part hoped I never would. I had rented a small furnished apartment just 10 minutes from the non-profit. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a narrow balcony overlooking an old church parking lot. There wasn't much furniture, but every piece belonged to me. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's space. I unpacked slowly. Helen's cardigan went into the closet, the photo albums onto a bookshelf. The wooden box rested on the small desk beside the window. Everything had a place. It wasn't a large apartment, but it was peaceful. That night I made myself grilled cheese and tomato soup. The same dinner Helen and I used to make whenever we didn't feel like cooking. I set 2 bowls on the counter out of habit, then quietly put one back. Some routines take longer to forget than grief itself. The next morning, my phone rang. Daniel. I stared at the screen until it stopped. A minute later, it rang again, then again. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't listen to it. Not yet. If I answered immediately, he'd ask me to come home. If I heard his voice, there was a chance I'd say yes, and I couldn't allow guilt to make my decision for me. Not this time. Around noon, there was another knock. This time, it was Caroline. She stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. I had a feeling you hadn't eaten breakfast. I smiled. You know me too well. I knew Helen. That helps. We sat near the window overlooking the parking lot. Neither of us mentioned Daniel. Instead, she unfolded a set of blueprints across the small table. We bought another building. I leaned closer. It was an abandoned elementary school built sometime in the 1950s. The roof needed replacing. Most of the plumbing was gone. Several classrooms had severe water damage. Most people would have seen a disaster. I saw possibilities. Caroline pointed toward the plans. We're converting it into affordable apartments for seniors. I studied every page.
Without realizing it, I had already begun making notes. The electrical layout won't work.
She smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I grabbed a pencil. This hallway is wasting space. We could move the laundry room here. The community kitchen should be closer to the courtyard. For nearly 3 hours, I forgot how old I was. I forgot why I'd left home. I forgot I had ever been called a burden. I was simply solving problems again. building something, contributing, living. When we finally looked up, the coffee had gone cold. Caroline laughed. I haven't seen you smile like that before. Neither had I, that evening. I finally listened to Daniel's voicemail. His voice sounded nothing like the confident man who had left for work that morning. Dad, a long pause. Emma told me. Another silence. I don't even know where to start. I'm sorry. I know that's probably not enough. His breathing became uneven. I came into your room. I saw everything was gone. I've never seen it that empty before. Another pause, then, quietly. I found your letter. My hands tightened around the phone. I haven't opened it yet. I don't think I deserve to. But if you're listening, his voice cracked. Please just tell me you're okay. I don't care where you are. I need to know you're okay. The voicemail ended. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I placed the phone face down on the table. I still didn't call him back. Not because I wanted to punish him, because some conversations need time before they're honest. And right now, his guilt was louder than his understanding. The following Monday was my first official day volunteering. By 8 o'clock that morning, I was wearing an old tool belt I hadn't used in years. The leather had cracked with age. My name was still written inside it in faded black marker, Richard Dawson. One by one, other volunteers arrived. Frank, a retired Marine who could repair almost anything with an engine. Louis, a former electrician with terrible jokes and perfect wiring. Margaret, a 74-year-old retired architect who insisted everyone stop calling her retired because she still worked harder than most people half her age. Nobody asked how much money I had. Nobody cared where I'd lived. Nobody treated me like fragile glass. They handed me a hard hat, pointed toward a broken staircase, and said the most beautiful sentence I'd heard in years. Richard, we could really use your help. For the first time since Helen died, I didn't feel like someone who needed taking care of. I felt like someone who still had something worth giving. And without realizing it, that was the first step toward becoming the man my son would one day struggle to recognize. The first few weeks at the nonprofit changed me in ways I never expected. Not because the work was easy, because it reminded me who I had been before grief and before guilt had slowly convinced me that my best years were behind me. Every morning, I arrived before 8. Old habits die hard. I'd unlock the tool shed, organize the equipment, and make a fresh pot of coffee before anyone else showed up. By 8:30, the building would come alive. Hammers echoed through the hallways. Power saws hummed in the distance. Someone was always laughing about something. It reminded me of construction sites from 30 years earlier. Only this time, nobody was racing against a deadline. We were building homes, not profits. One afternoon, Frank climbed down a ladder, shaking his head. Richard, what? I've been trying to hang this cabinet for 20 minutes. I walked over. The wall wasn't straight. It had settled over decades. The cabinet wasn't the problem. The building was. I grabbed a handful of wooden shims from my toolbox. 5 minutes later, the cabinet sat perfectly level. Frank stared at it. I hate how easily you make that look. I laughed. It only looks easy because I've made every possible mistake already. Louis overheard us. So wisdom is just expensive experience. Exactly, he grinned. Well, then you're the richest man on this job site. Everyone laughed, so did I. It had been a long time since laughter came naturally. A month later, Caroline called everyone together. I have an announcement. The room grew quiet. We've received funding for another renovation project. Cheers filled the room. Then she looked directly at me. And Richard has agreed to supervise the restoration. I nearly dropped the clipboard in my hands. I did? She smiled. You will. The room erupted into applause. I looked around in confusion. I haven't managed a team in years. Margaret folded her arms. So? Louis nodded. You forgot something. What? You've been managing us for the last month. I blinked. I have? Frank laughed. You assign jobs. You solve problems. You teach the new volunteers, you just haven't noticed. For the first time, I realized leadership doesn't disappear when you retire. Sometimes, it simply waits for someone to need it again. That evening, Caroline handed me a folder. Inside were architectural drawings for an abandoned public library. It'll become 12 apartments, she explained, plus a community workshop. A workshop? She nodded. For retired tradespeople, so they can teach younger volunteers. Exactly. I stared at the blueprints. Helen would have loved this. She always believed people needed purpose more than comfort. As I turned another page, something caught my eye. One room had been labelled the Dawson Workshop. I frowned. What is this? Caroline looked almost embarrassed. The board voted on it. You've inspired half our volunteers. I told them not to. They didn't listen. My throat tightened. I haven't done anything special. She smiled gently. Richard, you're measuring yourself by what you've lost. We're measuring you by what you've given. I couldn't answer, because for the first time in years, someone saw value in me that had nothing to do with being a father or a husband. They simply saw me. 3 months passed faster than I expected. The apartments began taking shape. The workshop walls went up. Local newspapers started writing small stories about retired volunteers rebuilding forgotten neighborhoods. I never paid much attention. Reporters came and went. Photographs were taken. I always found an excuse to step out of frame. Recognition had never interested me. The work did. One afternoon, a young volunteer named Marcus walked beside me carrying lumber. He couldn't have been older than 24. Mr. Dawson? Call me Richard. He smiled. Can I ask you something? Sure, weren't you retired? I was. So why are you working harder than everyone else? I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Because I spent too much time believing retirement meant my life was winding down. And now? I looked around the construction site, at the volunteers, the future residents, the sound of hope replacing silence. Now I know purpose doesn't retire. Marcus nodded slowly. I hope I'm still like that someday. His words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon, because months earlier, I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to become more like me. That night, after everyone had gone home, I locked the workshop and stood alone in the parking lot. The sunset painted the old brick building gold. I slipped my phone from my pocket. There were still unread messages from Daniel, voicemails, texts, missed calls, almost every week. He reached out, almost every week. I wasn't ready. Then I noticed something different. A new message had arrived only an hour earlier. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from Ethan. Just 7 simple words. Grandpa, I really miss you. Please call. I read those words 3 times. Then I sat down on a nearby bench. For the first time since leaving, I wasn't thinking about my son. I was thinking about the little boy who had once told me, I'm glad you live here. And I realized keeping my distance from Daniel was one thing, but staying away from my grandchildren was becoming a much harder promise to keep. I stared at Ethan's message for nearly 10 minutes. Grandpa, I really miss you. Please call. 7 words, no anger, no questions, no accusations, just honesty. Children have a way of saying exactly what adults spend years trying to hide. I wanted to call him immediately. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my pocket, not because I didn't miss him, but because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say. Grandpa left because your father accidentally broke his heart. No child should ever have to carry a sentence like that. The next afternoon, Caroline found me replacing broken floor joists in the workshop. You've been distracted all day. I have? You've measured the same board 3 times. I laughed quietly. That obvious. She climbed onto the platform beside me. Family? I nodded. My grandson. She smiled knowingly. I was wondering how long you'd hold out. I don't want to confuse him. You won't. I don't want him caught in the middle. She leaned against one of the unfinished walls. Richard, children already know when something's wrong. They don't need perfect explanations. They just need to know they're still loved. Her words stayed with me long after she'd walked away. That evening, I finally pressed the call button. "Grandpa?" His voice exploded through the speaker before the second ring had even finished. "Hi, buddy." "Oh my gosh! Lily!" Grandpa called. I heard little feet running across hardwood floors, then Lily's excited voice in the background. "Grandpa, are you coming home?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I closed my eyes. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. Were you mad at Dad?" Children always ask the hardest questions. "No." "Then why did you leave?" I looked out across the non-profit parking lot. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the old brick buildings. "Have you ever had two puzzle pieces that didn't fit together?" "Yeah. Does that mean either piece is bad?" "No, it just means they belong in different places." There was a long pause. "I think," Ethan finally said, "I understand a little." I smiled. "I think you do." For nearly 30 minutes they told me everything I'd missed. Lily had lost another front tooth. Ethan had made the honor roll. Their dog, Murphy, had somehow learned to open the pantry door. They argued over who got to tell each story first. For the first time since leaving. The distance between us didn't feel impossible. When the conversation finally slowed, Ethan's voice became quieter. "Grandpa, yeah? Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Did Dad make you leave? Children deserve honesty." But not burdens, so I chose my words carefully. "No. I made that decision myself." "Why?" "Because sometimes adults need different places to grow." Another silence then. "Do you still love Dad?" "Without hesitation," I answered. "More than he'll probably ever understand." The line became quiet, then I heard another voice, older, unsteady. "Richard?" Daniel, neither of us had realized he was listening. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, he said, "I'll let you go." His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. He swallowed hard. "I'm glad you're okay." I could hear everything he wasn't saying, the regret, the guilt, the sleepless nights. I wanted to make it easier for him, but healing built on rushed forgiveness rarely lasts. "I'm okay, Daniel." Another silence. That's all I wanted to know. He handed the phone back to Ethan. No arguments, no pleading, just relief. When the call ended, I sat alone on the workshop steps long after the screen went dark. For the first time, we hadn't spoken as father and son. We'd spoken as two men trying to find their way back to each other. Life continued moving forward. By early spring, the old library looked nothing like the abandoned building we'd first walked into. Families toured the finished apartments. Veterans filled out applications. Retired teachers volunteered to tutor neighborhood children in the community room. The workshop had become the busiest part of the building. Every Tuesday afternoon, I taught basic woodworking. Not because I considered myself an expert, because young people kept showing up wanting to learn. One Saturday, nearly 20 teenagers crowded around workbenches I'd helped build. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "You know what? You've accidentally become famous." I laughed. "I've done no such thing." He pointed toward the entrance. A local television crew had just walked inside. Behind them, a newspaper photographer. Then two city officials. Caroline walked over smiling. "I forgot to mention." "Forgot what?" "The city selected this project for its Community Impact Award." "That's wonderful." "It gets better." She handed me an invitation. My name was printed across the front. Guest of honor, Richard Dawson. I stared at the card. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. "I don't deserve this." Caroline smiled the same gentle smile Helen used to wear whenever I doubted myself. "No, Richard. You just haven't caught up to the man you've become." I looked around the workshop, the people laughing, the families moving into homes, the volunteers building furniture. And for the first time, I finally believed she might be right. What I didn't know was that someone else would soon read my name on that invitation. And the moment my son saw it, everything he believed about the father he had lost would begin to change. I almost threw the invitation away. Not because I wasn't grateful, because I had spent my entire life believing that work should speak for itself. Recognition had always made me uncomfortable. Carolyn refused to let me hide. "You'll be there. I don't own a suit anymore. We'll fix that. I don't need a ceremony." She smiled. "This ceremony isn't for you. It isn't. It's for everyone who's forgotten that growing older doesn't mean becoming invisible." I couldn't argue with that. The following week, preparations for the event took over the entire building. Volunteers painted signs. Residents planted flowers outside the entrance. The local high school offered to provide music. Someone even insisted on hanging a banner across the front of the old library, "Rebuilding Homes." Restoring Per. I stood across the street looking at it. Funny. Months earlier, I had walked away believing I had lost my purpose. Now strangers were celebrating it. Life has a peculiar sense of humor. 3 days before the ceremony, Caroline walked into the workshop carrying a newspaper. "You made the front page. I sincerely hope not." She laughed. "I'm afraid so." She unfolded it across my workbench. There I was, covered in sawdust, holding a tape measure, completely unaware someone had taken the photograph. The headline read, "Retired Transit Worker. Helps transform abandoned buildings into hope for seniors." I stared at the picture. It didn't look like me. Not because of the photograph, because the man in that picture looked alive. Carolyn pointed toward the bottom of the article. "They're expecting almost 300 guests." I nearly dropped the paper. 300. City council, local businesses, community leaders, the press, and the families moving into the apartments. I looked at her in disbelief. "I fix cabinets. You rebuild confidence." That's what they're honoring. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel was having one of the worst weeks of his career. A major client had backed out. His company announced layoffs. Half his department feared they were next. He barely noticed the stack of unopened mail sitting on the kitchen counter until Saturday morning. Emma was helping Lily with a school project while Ethan searched the newspaper for baseball scores. "Dad," Ethan suddenly frowned. "I think I know this guy." Daniel wasn't listening. "What guy?" "This one." He pushed the newspaper across the table. Daniel glanced down absent-mindedly, then froze. The coffee mug slipped slightly in his hand. His eyes locked onto the photograph. The room became completely silent. Emma looked over. "What is it?" He couldn't answer because beneath the photograph, he read the name, Richard Dawson. His father. The article wasn't about retirement. It wasn't about illness. It wasn't about needing help. It described a man leading one of the city's most respected volunteer restoration projects. A mentor, a project supervisor, someone local reporters called the heart of the organization. Daniel read every word twice, then a third time. Each sentence made less sense than the one before it. "He never told us." Emma quietly took the newspaper. As she read, tears slowly filled her eyes. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Daniel." Neither of them spoke for a long time, because the article revealed something they had never stopped to consider. Richard hadn't left to disappear. He had left to become himself again. That afternoon, Daniel drove alone, without really thinking about where he was going. Eventually, his car stopped outside the non-profit. Across the street, volunteers were hanging decorations for the ceremony. Families walked through the finished apartments smiling. Children played in the courtyard. For several minutes, he simply watched. Then he saw me. I was kneeling beside an elderly veteran, helping him adjust the height of a handcrafted bookshelf before it was moved into his new apartment. The veteran shook my hand. Then unexpectedly, he hugged me. Daniel had never seen strangers hug his father like that. A few minutes later, another volunteer walked over laughing. Then another. Someone handed me a clipboard. Someone else asked for advice. Everywhere Daniel looked, people weren't taking care of me. They were depending on me, respecting me, following me. He remained inside his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he wasn't remembering the father he thought he'd failed. He was meeting the man he had never truly understood, and then He saw something that broke his heart completely. A little boy, no older than 8, ran across the courtyard. "Mr. Richard," I smiled. "Easy there." The boy threw his arms around me. "I finished the birdhouse." "Did you? You said you'd help me paint it, I remember." The child grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the workshop. Without hesitation, I followed. Daniel watched through the windshield as his father laughed. Really laughed. The kind of laugh he hadn't heard since his mother was alive. Tears blurred his vision, because at that moment, he realized something painful. His father hadn't been waiting for someone to save him. He had simply been waiting for someone to believe he still mattered. And Daniel suddenly understood. The biggest mistake he'd ever made wasn't calling his father a burden. It was forgetting that the man who had spent his whole life carrying everyone else still needed a reason to keep carrying himself. Daniel didn't get out of the car. Not that day. He sat across the street for nearly an hour, watching people walk in and out of the renovated library. Some carried groceries, some pushed strollers. An elderly couple sat on a bench in the courtyard, smiling as children played nearby. Everywhere he looked, he saw something his father had helped build. Not with money, with time, with patience, with purpose. It was the same man Daniel had grown up admiring. The same man who had spent countless weekends repairing neighbors' fences without accepting a single dollar. The same father who taught him to tighten a bolt properly because, as he always said, if you're going to do something, do it in a way that lasts. Somewhere along the years, Daniel had forgotten those lessons. He drove home without speaking to anyone. Emma knew immediately where he'd been. "You saw him," he nodded. "How was he?" Daniel took longer than usual to answer. He searched for the right word. Happy. There was something almost painful about saying it out loud. Emma slowly sat beside him. "I'm glad." "So am I," but his voice didn't sound convincing, because another feeling had quietly settled beside relief, shame. That evening, Ethan found his father sitting alone on the back patio. "Dad, yeah? Did you see Grandpa?" Daniel nodded. "Can I ask something?" "Of course. Why doesn't Grandpa come home anymore?" Children always asked the questions adults avoided. Daniel looked across the yard. For months, he had blamed stress, work, bills, responsibilities. Now none of those explanations felt big enough. Finally, he answered as honestly as he could. "Because I hurt him." Ethan frowned. "You yelled at him?" "No." "You punished him?" "No." "Then how?" Daniel's eyes drifted toward the empty chair where Richard used to drink his morning coffee. "Sometimes," he whispered. Words hurt more than yelling. Ethan didn't fully understand, but he understood enough. He quietly sat beside his father, just as he had once sat beside his grandfather, without trying to fix anything. The next Monday, Daniel couldn't concentrate at work. Every meeting reminded him of the newspaper article. Every conversation echoed with Caroline's words he had overheard from across the parking lot. "Richard, could you look at this? Richard, what do you think? Richard, we need your help." "Need your help." The same words his father hadn't heard inside his own home for years. Around lunchtime, Daniel opened the envelope Richard had left behind. He had carried it in his briefcase ever since the day his father walked away. He had been afraid to read it, afraid of what it might say, afraid it might confirm everything he already believed about himself. Slowly, he unfolded the letter. "My dear son, if you're reading this, it means I've already left. Please don't waste your energy looking for someone to blame. Not yourself, not Emma, certainly not the children. No one forced me to leave. This was my decision. I know you'll probably remember the sentence you said, the one you never meant for me to hear. I want you to know something important. Those words hurt, but they didn't break me. What broke my heart was realizing you'd been carrying that weight alone for months because you didn't know how to tell me the truth." Daniel stopped reading, his vision blurred. He wiped his eyes, then continued. "When your mother was dying, she asked you to take care of me. She never asked you to sacrifice your own life. There's a difference. I should have recognized that sooner. I kept trying to fit into a place where all of us were slowly becoming unhappy. That's not what family is supposed to do. Daniel's hands trembled. The next paragraph was shorter. But somehow, it hurt the most. Son, you've spent your whole life trying to make me proud. The truth is, you've never stopped making me proud. Even on your worst day. Daniel lowered the letter. His shoulders began to shake. Emma quietly walked into the room. Without asking permission, she wrapped her arms around him. He handed her the letter. She read it silently. By the time she reached the final page, she was crying too. At the very bottom, Richard had written one last sentence. If we ever meet again, please don't apologize immediately. Sit with me. Tell me how you've been. I'd rather have my son back than hear the words, I'm sorry. Neither of them spoke for a very long time, because they both understood the same thing. Richard hadn't left out of anger. He had left out of love for himself, love for his family. Love strong enough to refuse living a life where everyone slowly resented one another. And for the first time, Daniel realized reconciliation wouldn't begin with convincing his father to come home. It would begin with becoming the kind of son his father could simply sit beside again. I didn't know Daniel had finally read my letter. I didn't know he'd driven past the non-profit, or that he'd stood across the street watching me laugh with people who, only months earlier, had been complete strangers. Life has a funny way of moving forward while someone else is still trying to catch up. For me, Tuesday morning began the same as every other. Coffee. A quiet walk around the courtyard, then a full day of work. The only difference was that Caroline seemed unusually nervous. She kept checking her watch, looking toward the front entrance, whispering with volunteers whenever she thought I wasn't paying attention. Finally, I walked over. All right. She looked up innocently. What? You're terrible at keeping secrets. She laughed. Am I that obvious? You've walked past this room 6 times in 10 minutes. She sighed. Fine. The mayor's office is coming today. I nearly dropped the paintbrush in my hand. The mayor? And a few reporters. I thought the ceremony was next week. It is. They want to see the project before then. I groaned. You know I hate interviews. I know. That's exactly why everyone likes talking to you. Around 11, several black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Out stepped city officials, reporters, photographers, and community leaders. I quietly slipped toward them. Maybe if I stayed busy, no one would notice me. I should have known better. Richard! Caroline's voice echoed across the courtyard. They'd like to meet you. I looked around, hoping there was another Richard nearby. There wasn't. One of the council members walked toward me with an outstretched hand. So you're the famous Richard Dawson. I smiled awkwardly. I'm just the guy who fixes crooked walls. He laughed. From what we've heard, you've been fixing much more than walls. They toured the apartments, asked questions about construction, funding, volunteer training, community outreach. Every answer Caroline gave somehow found its way back to the volunteers, especially the older ones. We didn't build this project, she told the group. They did. She pointed toward us. Most people think retirement is the end of usefulness. We wanted to prove the opposite. The reporters began writing faster. One young journalist turned toward me. Mr. Dawson, can I ask you something? I nodded. What made you decide to spend your retirement doing this? For a moment, I wasn't sure how to answer. Then Helen's face appeared in my memory, smiling from that hospital bed. Promise me you won't stop living. I smiled softly. My wife. The reporter looked confused. She believed every person still has something valuable to give. I glanced around the courtyard. I guess I'm just trying to keep my promise to her. No one spoke for several seconds. Sometimes, the simplest answers carry the most truth. That afternoon, after everyone had left, Caroline handed me an envelope. What's this? Open it. Inside was a handwritten letter, not from the city, not from a reporter. It was from Mr. Harold Bennett, the first resident who had moved into one of our completed apartments. I recognized the name immediately. Harold was a 78-year-old Korean War veteran, quite proud, the kind of man who apologized every time someone helped him carry groceries. I unfolded the letter. Richard, when I moved here, I thought I was just getting an apartment. I didn't realize I was getting my dignity back. The shelves you built let me unpack boxes I'd kept closed for 10 years. The ramp you insisted on adding means I can leave my home without asking someone to carry me. You probably think you build houses. You don't. You build independence, thank you. I read it twice, then carefully folded it again. I couldn't remember the last time a stranger's words had affected me so deeply. Caroline smiled. Now do you understand why we keep trying to honor you? I looked toward the apartment buildings. No, she laughed. I was afraid you'd say that. That evening, before heading home, I walked through the nearly finished workshop alone. Sunlight poured through the large windows. Fresh sawdust covered the floor. Workbenches lined the walls. Above the entrance hung a newly carved wooden sign. Dowson Workshoppy stood there for a long time. Not because my name was on it, because I knew exactly what Helen would have said. She would have smiled, crossed her arms, and teased me. See, I told you retirement would be your busiest years. I laughed quietly to myself. I guess you were right, sweetheart. As I turned off the lights and locked the door, I had no idea someone was standing across the street watching Daniel. He hadn't planned to come back, but something kept pulling him there. This time, he didn't stay inside his car. He took one deep breath, stepped onto the sidewalk, and began walking toward the building where his father had found a new life. Neither of us knew it yet, but the next few minutes would become one of the hardest moments either of us had ever faced. I was locking the workshop when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, uncertain. The kind of footsteps made by someone who wasn't sure they belonged where they were. I assumed it was one of the volunteers who had forgotten something. Without turning around, I said, "If you're looking for Frank, he left about 20 minutes ago." No answer. I slipped the keys into my pocket and turned. Daniel stood 10 feet away. For a second, neither of us moved. The last time we'd been this close, we'd been standing in his kitchen. He had no idea I had overheard those words. I had no idea they would become the last morning we shared as father and son, under one roof. Now, months had passed. His hair looked a little grayer, his shoulders seemed heavier, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that hadn't been there before. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Finally, "Hi, Dad." 3 simple words, but somehow they carried every missed phone call, every unread message, every sleepless night. I smiled gently. "Hi, son." For several awkward seconds we simply looked at each other. Neither of us seemed to know what came next. Daniel glanced around the courtyard. "It's beautiful." I looked toward the gardens. The volunteers deserve the credit. He shook his head. The article didn't exaggerate. I laughed quietly. Newspapers usually do. Not this one. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been here twice. That surprised me. You have." "The first time, I stayed in the car. I just watched." He looked embarrassed admitting it. I didn't think I had the right to walk in. I studied his face. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, only honesty. "You've lost weight," I said. He smiled weakly. "You still notice everything. Comes with age." He nodded. "I guess it does." The silence returned. Not uncomfortable this time, just unfamiliar. Finally, I pointed toward a wooden bench beneath an old maple tree. "You hungry?" He looked confused. "I know a diner 2 blocks away. They make terrible coffee, but the pie's worth the trip." For the first time that day, a faint smile appeared on his face. "You still remember that place?" "I've been going there since before you were born." We walked side by side without another word, exactly as my letter had asked. No apologies, just walking. The waitress recognized me the moment we stepped inside. "Richard," she smiled warmly, "you're usual. You know it." Then she noticed Daniel. "And who's this handsome young man?" I looked at my son. "This is Daniel. My boy." She grinned. "It's about time he came to meet us." Daniel looked surprised. You come here often? Every Thursday. She nodded enthusiastically. He brings birdhouses for the kids. Daniel turned toward me. You never told us that. I shrugged. It never came up. The waitress smiled. Half the children in this neighborhood have something your father built. Daniel looked down at the menu. He wasn't reading it. He was trying to absorb a version of me he had never known existed. When the pie arrived, we spent several minutes talking about ordinary things. Work, the weather, Ethan's baseball season. Lily losing another tooth. It felt strangely natural, as if we were carefully rebuilding a bridge, one wooden plank at a time. Then Daniel set his fork down. I read your letter. I nodded once. I figured you had. He looked out the diner window before speaking again.
I wanted to apologize, I know, but he swallowed.
I remembered what you wrote. I smiled. You listened, I tried. Another long silence settled between us. Finally, he asked the question he'd carried for months. When did you stop being happy? I didn't answer immediately because the truthful answer mattered. I wasn't unhappy because of you. He looked unconvinced. I wasn't. I was lonely after your mother died. I was grateful when you asked me to move in, and for a while, I really was happy. So what changed? I stirred my coffee slowly. Do you remember teaching Ethan how to ride a bicycle? He frowned. Yeah. What happened after he learned? I let go. Why? Because he didn't need me holding the seat anymore. I looked at him. That's what happened to us. You didn't stop loving me. You simply didn't know when holding on had started hurting both of us. Daniel lowered his head. A tear landed silently on the table. I never wanted you to feel unwanted. I know. I was just tired, I finished gently. He looked up, surprised. Yes, I know. I could hear it in your voice that morning. I should have talked to you. You should have. I was afraid. Of what? That you'd think I didn't love you. I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. I never questioned your love. He blinked. You didn't? No. I questioned whether you were drowning. His shoulders began shaking. I know. I just didn't realize that I was pulling you under with me. I squeezed his hand. Neither of us realized. For the first time since Helen died, I looked at my son and didn't see the man who had called me a burden. I saw the frightened little boy who had once climbed into my lap after every nightmare, believing his father could fix anything. The difference now was that this was one problem I couldn't fix for him. He had to forgive himself. And I knew that would be far harder than earning my forgiveness. We stayed in that little diner until the afternoon crowd began filling the booths. Neither of us noticed the time. For months, we had imagined this conversation 100 different ways. In every version, there were dramatic speeches, tears, perfect apologies. Instead, we talked about life, real life, the kind that rarely gives anyone perfect words. As we walked back toward the non-profit, Daniel looked around the neighborhood. I understand now. I smiled. Understand what? You didn't leave to get away from us. He looked toward the apartment buildings. You left because you needed somewhere you could still matter. I stopped walking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. Yes, it took me a long time to admit that. We sat on a bench overlooking the courtyard. A young mother was teaching her little daughter how to water flowers. Across the way, Frank and Luis were arguing over whose coffee tasted worse. Some things never changed. Daniel watched them for a while. They all respect you. They're good people. They listen when you speak. I laughed. They argue with me more than they listen. He smiled. I wish I'd seen this sooner. I looked at him carefully. Would it have changed anything? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, I think it would have changed me. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut wood from the workshop. Daniel stared toward the building. I keep thinking about Mum, so do I. What would she say if she saw us now? I smiled before I answered. She'd tell us we were both being stubborn. For the first time that afternoon, Daniel laughed. 100%. Then she'd make us sit at the kitchen table. She'd bake that apple pie nobody could ever copy, and she'd refuse to let either of us leave until we'd talked. His smile slowly disappeared. I miss her, so do I, every day. I know. After a long silence, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. I found something. He carefully unfolded a small piece of paper. It was old. The edges had turned yellow. I recognized it immediately. My heart skipped a beat. You kept that? I found it inside Mum's Bible after she died. He handed it to me. It was Helen's handwriting. I'd know those neat blue letters anywhere. At the top she had written only one sentence for my boys. If you ever forget what family means. I swallowed hard before reading. Love is not measured by how tightly you hold on to each other. It's measured by whether you make room for each other to grow. One day, Richard will need to discover who he is without being my husband. One day, Daniel will need to discover who he is without needing his father's protection. If either of you tries to stop the other from growing, you'll both become unhappy. Please don't confuse love with sacrifice. The people who love you most should also leave room for you to become who you're meant to be. And if life ever pulls you apart for a while, find your way back with kindness, never with pride. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at the page. Daniel finally whispered she knew. I smiled sadly. Helen usually did. Did you ever read this? I slowly shook my head. No, then how? She told me something very similar in the hospital. He folded the note carefully. I spent months thinking I failed her. I looked at my son. No, you misunderstood her. So did I. Just then, Caroline walked across the courtyard carrying 2 folders. She stopped when she saw Daniel. So, she smiled warmly, you finally introduced yourself. Daniel stood. You must be Caroline, guilty. He extended his hand. I owe you a thank you. She looked confused. For what? You gave my father something I didn't know he was missing. Caroline gently shook her head. No, I only gave him a place. He brought the purpose with him. I looked away, slightly embarrassed. She ignored me. As a matter of father saved us. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Caroline pointed toward the workshop. When Richard arrived, we were losing volunteers. Projects were behind schedule. Older volunteers felt like no one valued their experience. Then he started teaching. He started listening. He made every retired person here feel useful again. She smiled at me. Buildings weren't the only things he rebuilt. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. I never knew. No, I answered honestly. You never had a reason to. Before leaving, Daniel hesitated. Dad, yeah? Would it be okay? He looked toward the workshop. If you showed me around? I smiled. I'd like that. For the next 2 hours, I didn't give him a tour of a building. I gave him a tour of the life I had built after walking away. He met Frank, who immediately teased him. So you're the famous son. He met Luis, who insisted on showing him the cabinets we'd argued over for weeks. He met Margaret, who told Daniel, your father still works too hard. Daniel laughed. I've been hearing that my whole life. Everywhere we walked, someone stopped to thank me. Not because I was extraordinary, because I'd simply been present, available, useful. As the sun began to set, Daniel quietly said, I finally understand the title they gave you in that article. What title? He smiled through misty eyes. The heart of the organization. I used to think your greatest achievement was raising me. He looked around the courtyard one last time. I was wrong. You taught me something even more important. I raised an eyebrow. What's that? He looked directly at me. That it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. And for the first time since I had walked out of his house, it no longer felt like we were saying goodbye. It felt like we were finding our way home. A week after Daniel visited the non-profit, the Community Impact Award ceremony finally arrived. I tried every excuse I could think of. I'm not good at speeches, Caroline smiled. Perfect. I don't even own a proper suit. Margaret rolled her eyes. We fixed that yesterday. I'd rather stay in the workshop. Frank laughed. That's exactly why you're not allowed. Some battles simply aren't worth fighting. So for the first time in years, I put on a navy blue suit. The last time I'd worn one was at Helen's funeral. Standing in front of the mirror that morning, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, because the sadness I'd carried for so many years no longer seemed to define my face. I picked up the framed photograph of Helen from my dresser. "You'd probably tell me to straighten my tie." I smiled. "So, there you go." For just a second, it felt as though she smiled back. By early afternoon, the courtyard was full. Families who had moved into the apartments. Veterans, volunteers, local business owners, city officials, reporters. Children chased each other between flower beds we'd planted only months earlier. It didn't feel like an awards ceremony. It felt like a neighborhood celebrating itself. Exactly the way it should. Caroline stepped onto the small stage first. She welcomed everyone, thanked the donors, recognized the volunteers, then she paused. "There is one person who never wanted today to be about him." The crowd laughed, which is precisely why it should be. I quietly lowered my head. She looked directly at me. "Would you join me?" Frank nudged my shoulder. "Go on." I slowly walked toward the stage. The applause began politely, then grew louder and louder, until nearly everyone was standing. I froze halfway up the steps. I had never experienced anything like it, not in 38 years of work, not in retirement, never. I looked out across the crowd, then suddenly, I saw them: Daniel, Emma, Ethan, Lily, standing together near the front. Lily waved both hands excitedly. "Grandpa." Several people laughed warmly. I couldn't stop smiling. Daniel didn't wave. He simply placed his hand over his heart. A gesture so small, yet somehow it said everything words couldn't. Caroline handed me the award. It wasn't large, just a simple wooden plaque, handcrafted in our own workshop. Across the front were engraved the words, "Richard Dawson, for proving that purpose has no retirement age." I ran my fingers across the wood. It meant more than crystal ever could, because someone here had made it, with their own hands. Just as we'd built everything else, the mayor stepped forward. "I've attended many ceremonies, but this project reminds us of something we've forgotten." He looked toward the volunteers. "Our greatest natural resource isn't land, it isn't money, it isn't buildings, it's experience." He turned toward me. "Mr. Dawson, you reminded this city that growing older doesn't mean becoming less valuable." The audience applauded again. I wish they'd stop, not because I wasn't grateful, because I didn't know how to carry that kind of praise. Then someone handed me the microphone. I immediately looked for Caroline. She smiled. No escaping. The crowd laughed. I cleared my throat. I wasn't planning to speak. A few people clapped anyway. So, I'll keep this simple. I looked around the courtyard. Months earlier, I would have seen strangers. Now, I saw friends. I spent a long time believing my best years were behind me. I admitted, honestly. I thought retirement meant the work of my life was finished. I shook my head. I was wrong. Very wrong. I looked toward the young volunteers, standing beside retirees. I've learned something. People don't stop needing purpose because they grow older. They stop believing they still have one. The courtyard became completely silent. If you're lucky enough to wake up tomorrow, there is still someone you can encourage, something you can build, someone you can teach, someone you can love. And if that's true, then your life is still creating value. I paused. My eyes found Daniel again. I also learned something else, Al. The people who love us, they aren't supposed to carry us forever. Sometimes, the greatest gift they can give us is the space to stand on our own again. Daniel lowered his head. Emma quietly reached for his hand. I smiled gently. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give the people we love is letting them know we'll be okay. When I finished, the applause lasted longer than I expected, not because it was a great speech, because it came from the truth. As people gathered around afterward, asking for photographs and shaking my hand, I noticed Daniel hanging back. He wasn't trying to interrupt, he was waiting, portly. The way I had once waited, while teaching him to fish as a little boy. Eventually the crowd thinned. He walked over. Without saying a word, he handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" I found it while cleaning the attic. I opened it carefully. Inside was an old photograph, me 35 years younger, standing behind a 10-year-old Daniel as he proudly held the crooked little birdhouse we'd built together. On the back, in Helen's handwriting, were 6 simple words: his first teacher, his forever hero. My vision blurred. Daniel's voice trembled. "You know, I spent months thinking I'd lost my father." He swallowed hard. But standing here today, he looked around the courtyard filled with people laughing because of something we'd built together. "I finally understand. You were never lost." He smiled through tears. "I was." I stepped forward, wrapped my arms around my son, and for the first time since the morning, I quietly walked out of his house. He hugged me back like the little boy who once believed his father could fix anything. Only this time, neither of us was trying to fix the past. We were simply grateful that we still had a future together. Life didn't magically become perfect after the ceremony. Movies like to end with one emotional hug. Real life begins after it. Daniel and I still had years of unspoken memories to sort through. Trust doesn't return overnight. It returns through ordinary days. Phone calls, coffee, showing up, again and again. The Monday after the ceremony, my phone rang at exactly 7:15 in the morning. "Daniel, this time." I answered before the second ring. "Morning, Dad. Morning." "I was wondering." He hesitated. "Are you busy Saturday?" I looked around the workshop. "I usually am, I know. I was hoping you could teach Ethan and me how to build a picnic table." I smiled. "Does Ethan know which end of the hammer to hold?" Daniel laughed. "Not yet." "Good. Then we'll start with the basics." Saturday arrived with bright blue skies. Ethan climbed out of Daniel's truck carrying safety goggles that were almost too big for his face. Lily followed behind holding a pink toolbox she'd insisted on bringing. "I have tools too, Grandpa." I looked inside. Crayons, bandages, a stuffed rabbit. I nodded seriously. "Looks like you're in charge of quality control." She beamed. The workshop quickly filled with familiar sounds: wood being measured, sandpaper sliding across rough boards, children laughing every time someone made a mistake. Ethan accidentally drove one screw in crooked. He groaned. "I ruined it." I shook my head. "No." I handed him another piece of wood. "You learned something. What's the difference?" "Mistakes are only expensive if you refuse to learn from them." Daniel quietly looked at me. "I think I've heard that somewhere before." "You were about 12. I ignored it then too. We both laughed. For the first time in years, our laughter sounded effortless. Around lunchtime, Lily tugged on my sleeve. "Grandpa?" "Yes, can I ask you something?" "Always." She looked up with complete innocence. "Are you coming back to live with us now?" The workshop suddenly became very quiet. Even Daniel stopped sanding. I knelt beside her. "What makes you ask that?" "Because everybody's happy again. Children see the world so simply." I gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "You know something?" "What?" "There are lots of ways to come home," she frowned. "I don't understand." I smiled. "I don't have to live in your house to be part of your life." She thought about that, then nodded. "So, you'll still come to my birthday?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world." "And Saturday pancakes?" "I think that's a family tradition now." She wrapped her arms around my neck. "Okay." To her, that was enough. Adults often complicate what children accept with love. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to dinner, not because he wanted me to move back, just because he wanted me there. That difference meant everything. Emma greeted me at the door with a warm hug. "I'm making Helen's lasagna." I smiled. "That's a dangerous promise." She laughed nervously. "I know it won't be as good." "It doesn't have to be." The dining room looked exactly the same table, same chairs, same window overlooking the backyard. Only one thing had changed. No one felt trapped anymore. Conversation flowed naturally. Lily talked about school. Ethan proudly announced he'd built another birdhouse by himself. Emma teased Daniel for burning hamburgers the previous weekend, and I simply enjoyed being a father, not a responsibility, not a guest, just family. After dinner, Daniel and I walked into the backyard. The old chair where I'd once sat every morning was still there. I never moved it, he admitted. I noticed. I couldn't. We stood quietly for a while, then he looked at me. I need you to know something. I waited. I don't want you to come back. I smiled. I know. His eyes widened. No. I mean, he laughed awkwardly. That sounded terrible. It didn't. I don't want you to leave the life you've built. He looked toward the stars. I finally understand that loving someone doesn't mean asking them to give up what makes them feel alive. For a moment, I couldn't speak because those words were exactly what Helen had tried to teach both of us. You've grown, I finally whispered. He smiled. As I drove home that night, I realized something beautiful. The house I'd left no longer felt like the place where my life had fallen apart. It had become the place where my son had grown into the man I always hoped he'd become. And my little apartment, it no longer felt temporary. It was home, not because of the walls, because it held the life I'd chosen. Sometimes people think a happy ending means getting everything back exactly the way it was. They're wrong. The happiest endings happen when everyone grows enough to stop wishing for the past and start being grateful for the present. I had no idea. The greatest surprise of my life was still waiting for me. Autumn arrived quietly. The maple trees outside the workshop turned shades of red and gold. Children kicked piles of leaves across the courtyard. The mornings grew colder. So did the coffee. Frank insisted colder coffee tasted better. Everyone agreed he was completely wrong. Some traditions are worth protecting. Life had settled into a rhythm I never imagined possible. 3 days a week, I supervised renovation projects. Thursday afternoons belonged to the woodworking class. Every other Saturday, Ethan came to help. Lily still believed her pink toolbox was an essential part of every construction project. And every Sunday evening, Daniel called, not because he felt guilty, because he genuinely wanted to know how my week had been. Sometimes we'd talk for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Neither of us forced the conversations anymore. They simply happened, the way family is supposed to. One Thursday afternoon, Caroline walked into the workshop carrying a long cardboard box. She placed it on my workbench without saying a word. "What did you buy now?" she smiled. "I didn't. Open it." Inside was a beautifully carved walnut plaque. Across the top were engraved the words, "The Helen Dawson Community Workshop." I stared at it. Certain I had read it wrong, I looked up. "My name," Caroline gently interrupted. "We changed it." "Why?" she smiled. "Because every time someone asked you why you were here, you gave the same answer." I made a promise to my wife. She folded her arms. The board voted unanimously. This place exists because you kept that promise. So now, her name belongs here too. I couldn't speak. I simply rested my hand against the smooth wood. For the first time since Helen died, it felt like we'd built something together again. The dedication ceremony was small. Nothing like the City Award, just volunteers, residents, families, people who actually lived the story. Carolyn invited me to say a few words. I kept them short. Helen believed people should leave the world kinder than they found it. I looked toward the workshop doors. I think she'd like this place. Then I stepped away from the microphone, because some moments become smaller when you explain them too much. As people gathered inside afterward, Daniel quietly walked over. "Dad, yeah? I have something." He handed me a folded set of papers. "What is it?" "Our wills." I looked confused. "You don't need to show me that, I know." "I want to." He pointed to one paragraph. "If anything ever happens to Emma and me, we've asked if you'd become guardian of Ethan and Lily." I looked at him in complete surprise. He smiled. "Only until they're adults. I know, but..." He swallowed. "I wanted you to know. I don't see you as someone who needs taking care of anymore." His voice trembled. I see you as the man I'd trust most to take care of the people I love." For a moment, the world around us disappeared. Months earlier, he had called me a burden. Now, he was telling me I was the person he trusted most. Life doesn't always erase painful memories. Sometimes, it redeems them. I folded the papers carefully and handed them back. "I hope this never becomes necessary." "So do I. But thank you." He smiled. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. Trust is a gift, and gifts should never be taken for granted." He nodded quietly. "I learned that from you." That evening, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind in the workshop. The new sign hung proudly above the entrance. The Helen Dawson Community Workshop. I switched off the lights one by one. Before locking the door, I looked back one last time. Months earlier, I had walked away from a house believing I had lost my place in the world. Now, I understood something Helen had known all along. Purpose isn't something another person gives you. It's something you choose to keep living. As I stepped outside, I noticed Daniel waiting beside my truck. "You heading home?" he asked. I smiled. "I already am." He smiled back. For the first time in a very long time, we both understood exactly what that meant. 3 years passed faster than I ever expected. The little non-profit that had once struggled to finish a single building had grown into something much bigger. We had restored 4 apartment buildings, opened 2 community workshops, started apprenticeship programs for young tradespeople, retired electricians taught teenagers, former nurses trained caregivers, old carpenters passed down skills that would have disappeared with them. The idea Helen had planted all those years ago had become a movement. I still lived in the same small apartment overlooking the old church. People often asked why I never bought a larger house. I always gave the same answer. I already have everything I need. And it was true. Peace doesn't require extra bedrooms. Daniel's life had changed too. He left the company that had slowly consumed him. Instead of chasing promotions that kept him away from his family, he accepted a position with a smaller engineering firm. Less money, better hours. Every Wednesday evening, he coached Ethan's baseball team. Every Friday night belonged to family dinner, sometime at his house, sometimes at mine, sometimes in the workshop, where Lily insisted pizza tasted better surrounded by sawdust. She was probably right. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan walked beside me through the workshop. He was 16 now, nearly as tall as I was. "Grandpa?" "Yeah, I've been thinking. Dangerous habit." He laughed. "I want to study engineering. Your dad will like that." He nodded. "But I also want to keep building things." He looked around the workshop. "I don't ever want people to think work is only about making money." I stopped walking because I suddenly realized the lesson had reached a 3rd generation. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you build, build something that leaves people's lives better than you found them." He smiled. "I will." That autumn, the city organized its annual Community Builders Gala. I almost didn't attend. Some habits never change. Carolyn practically dragged me there. The ballroom was filled with business leaders, volunteers, teachers, firefighters, people who quietly made the city a better place. Near the entrance stood a large display celebrating the nonprofit's journey. Photographs from every project covered the walls. One picture caught my attention. It showed me kneeling beside that little boy who had wanted help painting a birdhouse years earlier. He wasn't little anymore. He was now one of our volunteer instructors. Standing beside the photograph was a short caption. "One act of kindness often becomes another." I smiled. Maybe that was the real legacy after all. Later that evening, a young reporter approached Daniel. She held a microphone and smiled. "Excuse me, you're Richard Dawson's son, aren't you?" Daniel nodded. I am. I have one question." She pointed toward me across the room, where I was laughing with volunteers around one of the display tables. "What does it feel like watching your father become one of the city's most respected community leaders after retirement?" Daniel looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then he smiled.
You know, people always ask the wrong question.
The reporter looked confused. What do you mean? They ask what my father became. He shook his head gently. That's not the miracle. The miracle is, he finally became the man he never had time to be. The reporter lowered her microphone. I like that. Daniel's eyes never left mine. So do I. Later that night, as guests began leaving, Daniel walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me. The coffee's terrible. I took a sip. It really is. We both laughed. Then he grew quiet. Dad, yeah? Do you remember that morning? I knew exactly which morning he meant. I do. I think about it sometimes. So do I. He looked down into his coffee. For a long time, I wished I could erase it. I gently shook my head. If you erase that morning, you'd erase everything that came after it. He frowned. But it hurt you. Yes, it did. I looked around the ballroom at Caroline, at Frank and Luis arguing near the buffet, at families whose apartments we'd rebuilt, at teenagers proudly talking about projects they'd completed, at Ethan helping an elderly veteran find his seat, at Lily laughing while decorating cookies with residents. Then I looked back at my son.
If I hadn't walked away, I would have never found this. And
I smiled warmly. You might never have found yourself either. His eyes filled with tears. This time, neither of us looked away. When the evening ended, we walked outside together. The air was cool. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk. For a while, we simply stood beneath the streetlights, exactly as we had months after our first reunion. Only now, there was no distance between us. Dad? Yes, I'm proud of you, I smiled. I've always been proud of you. He laughed softly. I know. I finally believe you. He hugged me, not because he needed forgiveness, not because I needed an apology, simply because we were father and son. And sometimes, that's reason enough. As I drove home, I thought about everything that had happened since that rainy Tuesday morning, the day I overheard my son call me a burden. If someone had told me then, that one painful sentence would eventually lead me to a new purpose, a new family, a stronger relationship with my son, and a life filled with more meaning than I had ever imagined, I never would have believed them. Life rarely gives us the future we planned. Sometimes it gives us the future we needed. I unlocked my apartment door, placed Helen's photograph on the kitchen table, and smiled. You were right. As usual. The room was quiet, but it didn't feel empty, because love has a remarkable way of staying. Not in houses, not in possessions, not even in memories alone. It stays in the lives we touch, the people we lift, the kindness we leave behind. And if there's one thing I've learned after 72 years, it's this: no one becomes a burden because they grow older. They only become invisible when the world forgets to see their value.
Fortunately, the people who truly love you eventually learn to look again. Before you go, I want to ask you something.
If you were in Daniel's place, do you think you would have realized your mistake sooner? Or if you were Richard, would you have had the courage to walk away and start over? Let me know your answer in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share stories that remind us about family, forgiveness, second chances, and the quiet strength it takes to keep moving forward. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself and never let the people you love wonder how much they mean to you.